15-minute logic. Peirce considered semiotic and logic, in the broad sense, to be synonymous terms, as is evident in the following excerpts from a lengthy 1901 manuscript on logic, the first chapter of a projected book to have been entitled Minute Logic. If, as Peirce held, all thinking is inference from signs and every sign relation possesses a quality of mentality or thirdness, then logic, the science of sound thinking, is the science of sign relations. When Peirce argues that human reasoning is analogous to the action of a calculating machine, he is not arguing as Hobbes does for the materiality of the self, but is simply denying that logicality is exclusively human or cerebral. Logic should therefore not be premised upon either psychological or supposedly introspective knowledge of the nature of mental operations, but upon the logicality of nature, that is, upon a logical quality in external reality. This implies the objective reality not only of the sign relation but also of truth, a point of difference between Peirce and some semioticians of our day. He therefore outlines an argument for thirdness as a mode of being, which explains how there may be such a thing as a life in signs. Source, MS 425a. When we have finished a process of thinking, and come to the logical criticism of it, the first question we ask ourselves is, what did I conclude? To that we answer with some form of words, probably. Yet we had probably not been thinking in any such form, certainly not, if our thought amounted to anything. Our whole logical criticism consists in investigating whether or not to one portion of knowledge, expressed presumably in a very different form from that in which it was thought, we can, without serious danger of error, attach a certain addition. What the process of thinking may have been, has nothing to do with this question. There may, for aught we know or care, be 100 ways of thinking in passing from such a premise to such a conclusion. But the question is, whether, granting that there be such a thing as truth, which can be ascertained at all, such a way of adding conclusion to premise, as that under examination, would lead to the ascertainment of the truth by the speediest path, or not. The whole logical inquiry relates to the truth. Now the very idea of truth is that it is quite independent of what you or I may think it to be. How we think, therefore, is utterly irrelevant to logical inquiry. I must be excused for dwelling on this point, for no other in all logic, although it is a science of subtleties, is so hard to see. The confusion is, although it is a science of subtleties, is so hard to see. The confusion is embedded in language, leaving no words available to epigrammatize the error. Now it is not of fools exclusively, but of the greater part of the thinking world that words are the money. A celebrated treatise by Hobbes is entitled Logic, or Computation, and although not all reasoning is computation, it is certainly true that numerical computation is reasoning. But calculating machines are in everyday use, and Babbage's analytical engine would perform considerable feats in mathematics. Other logical machines have been constructed. All those instruments perform inferences, and those inferences are subject to the rules of logic. If from true premises they always yield true conclusions, what more could be desired? Yet those machines have no souls that we know of. They do not appear to think, at all, in any psychical sense, and even if we should discover that they do so, it would be a fact altogether without bearing upon the logical correctness of their operations, which we should still have to assure ourselves of in the same way we do now. The idea I am endeavoring to convey is difficult to seize. It cannot be seized by a reader who, instead of trying to seize it, puts himself into a resolutely hostile posture of mind toward it. Does he wish to know what I mean? If so, let him postpone criticism until he clearly apprehends what it is that is to be criticized. There are many minds who will be so occupied with a certain objection, that it will quite eclipse the sense of what I have been saying. They will urge that those machines do not perform any inference, at all, that it is, on the contrary, we, who, knowing how they are constructed, be it in detail or in a general way, by testimony, infer that the number which is exhibited at the end of the process must be in a certain arithmetical relation to the numbers which determine the setting and working of the machine. It will further be urged that if those machines were to be regarded as reasoning, there are others which would reason in far higher ways. For the calculating machines only execute variations upon 1 + 1 = 2, while there are machines which may, with as much justice, be said to resolve problems before which generations of able mathematicians have fallen back, repulsed. Such, for example, are the solids of different shapes which yacht designers drag through the water, and thereby come to the knowledge of arcana of hydrodynamics. Blocks of wood should seem, then, on my principles, to be better reasoners than the brains of Gauss and Stokes. And why stop here? Any apparatus whatever used for experimentation would be, on the same principle, a logical machine. A steam engine would be working out, at every revolution, its problem in thermodynamics, a simple match, scratched on a box, a question that we are unequal so much as to the formulating of it. This sounds crushing. What have I to say to it all? Simply that it is absolutely just. A logical machine differs from any other machine merely in working upon an excessively simple principle which is applied in a manifold and complex way, instead of upon an occult principle applied in a monotonous way. If anybody wishes me to acknowledge that a logical machine reasons no more than any other machine, I do not know why I should not gratify him. That seems to me a matter of words. The result which the logical machine turns out has a relation to the data with which it was fed, which relation may be considered from the point of view of whether the former could be false so long as the latter are true. That is all there is in the facts of the case, and whether it is called reasoning or not I do not care. All that I insist upon is, that, in like manner, a man may be regarded as a machine which turns out, let us say, a written sentence expressing a conclusion, the man-machine having been fed with a written statement of fact, as premise. Since this performance is no more than a machine might go through, it has no essential relation to the circumstance that the machine happens to work by geared wheels, while a man happens to work by an ill-understood arrangement of brain cells, and if there be room for less, still less to the circumstance that a man thinks. Say, if you like, that thinking has everything to do with the life of reasoning, I still insist that it has nothing to do with the logical criticism, which is equally applicable to the machine's performances and to the man's. This is simply the question of whether or not the conclusion can be false while the premise is true, together with modifications of this question. Were it a question of whether man can reason ill, it might be well to examine the process and mechanism of his thinking. But there is no question that he often does reason ill, and that is the reason why we criticize reasoning and why we inquire whether or not a given way of proceeding from premise to conclusion is conducive to the ascertainment of truth or the reverse. Logic is obliged to suppose, it need not assert, that there is knowledge embodied in some form, and that there is inference, in the sense that one embodiment of knowledge affects another. It is not obliged even so much as to suppose that there is consciousness. Descartes was of opinion that animals were unconscious automata. He might as well have thought that all men but himself were unconscious. To suppose them so does not annul the rules of logic. It still remains true that such and such a habit of determining one virtual store of knowledge by another will result in the concentration of action so as to bring about definite ends. The essence of rationality lies in the fact the rational being will act so as to attain certain ends. Prevent his doing so in one way, and he will act in some utterly different way which will produce the same result. Rationality is being governed by final causes. Consciousness, the feeling of the passing instant, has, as such, no room for rationality. The notion that logic is in any way concerned with it is a fallacy closely allied to hedonism in ethics. At this point, I interpose a psychological chapter, not for the purpose of introducing psychological matter into logic, but for the purpose of making its irrelevancy quite clear. All our thoughts are signs, and I here consider how they are so, and show that it is in their character as signs that logic is applicable to them. Further, logic is applicable to all signs whether they are directly mental or not. But now we have to examine whether there be a doctrine of signs corresponding to Hegel's objective logic, that is to say, whether there be a life in signs, so that the requisite vehicle being present they will go through a certain order of development, and if so, whether this development be merely of such a nature that the same round of changes of form is described over and over again whatever be the matter of the thought or whether, in addition to such a repetitive order, there be also a greater life history that every symbol furnished with a vehicle of life goes through, and what is the nature of it. There are minds who will pooh-pooh an idea of this sort, much as they would pooh-pooh a theory involving fairies. I have no objection to the pooh-poohing of fairies, provided it be critical pooh-poohing, but I wish I had the leisure to place before those gentlemen a work to be entitled The History of Pooh-poohing. I think it would do them good, and make room in their minds for an essay upon the logic of pooh-poohing. Mind, that if some forenoon, while I was in the midst of one of the most valuable of the chapters of my minute logic, a rap should come at my outer door, and if, upon going to the door, I were to find two men who proposed to come in and discuss with me the principles of Mormonism or Christian Science, I should promptly recommend them to apply elsewhere. This I should do upon the same grounds upon which I declined to join the American Psychical Research Society when it was started, namely, that I thought that to do so would be to sanction a probable great waste of time, together with the placing of some men in a compromising position. In like manner, if a reader who has thought it worthwhile to listen to what I have had to say upon normative logic finds objective logic too remote from his interests to care to listen to any discussion of it, I shall fully approve of his allowing the leaves of my chapter upon this subject to remain uncut. But my own position is different. It lies directly in the path of my duty to consider the question critically. The first question, then, which I have to ask is, supposing such a thing to be true, what is the kind of proof which I ought to demand to satisfy me of its truth? Am I simply to go through the actual process of development of symbols with my own thoughts, which are symbols, and am I to find in the sense of necessity and evidence of the following of one thought upon another an adequate assurance that the course followed is the necessary line of thought's development? That is the way the question has usually been put, hitherto, both by Hegelians and by anti-Hegelians. But even if I were to find that the sequence of conceptions in Hegel's logic carried my mind irresistibly along its current, that would not suffice to convince me of its universal validity. Nor, on the other hand, does the mere fact that I do not find a single step of Hegel's logic or any substitutes for it that I have met with either convincing or persuasive, give me any assurance whatever that there is no such life history. It seems to me natural to suppose that it would be far easier satisfactorily to answer the question of whether there is such a thing than to find out what particular form that life history would take if it were a reality, and not only natural to suppose so, but made as certain by solid reasons as any such anticipation in regard to proofs could well be. I am not one of those transcendental apothecaries, as I call them, they are so skillful in making up a bill, who call for a quantity of big admissions, as indispensable Voraussetzungen of logic. I am not so indulgent as Moliere's Argon, to suppose that they can seriously expect as much as half their demands to be allowed. I reduce the indispensability of their postulates far more than that, namely, all the way from universality to the single case that happens to have come up, and even then, I do not admit that indispensability is any ground of belief. It may be indispensable that I should have $500 in the bank, because I have given checks to that amount. But I have never found that the indispensability directly affected my balance, in the least. When a hand at whist has reached the point at which each player has but 3 cards left, the one who has to lead often goes on the assumption that the cards are distributed in a certain way, because it is only on that assumption that the odd trick can be saved. This is indisputably logical, and on a more critical analogous occasion there might be some psychological excuse, or even warrant, for a will to believe that such was really the case. But all that logic warrants is a hope, and not a belief. It must be admitted, however, that such hopes play a considerable part in logic. For example, when we discuss a vexed question, we hope that there is some ascertainable truth about it, and that the discussion is not to go on forever and to no purpose. A transcendentalist would claim that it is an indispensable presupposition that there is an ascertainable true answer to every intelligible question. I used to talk like that, myself, for when I was a babe in philosophy, my bottle was filled from the udders of Kant. But by this time, I have come to want something more substantial. But whatever be the kind and degree of our logical assurance that there is any real world, external or internal, that same kind and degree of assurance we certainly have that there not only may be a living symbol, realizing the full idea of a symbol, but even that there actually is one. I examine the question from this point of view. It certainly seems as if the mere hypothesis of such a thing as a symbol sufficed to demonstrate such a life history. Still, a fallacy is to be suspected. How can a mere hypothesis prove so much as this seems to prove, if it proves anything? I call in the data of experience not exactly the every-minute experience which has hitherto been enough, but the experience of most men, together with the history of thought. The conclusion seems the same. Yet still, the evidence is unsatisfactory. The truth is that the hypothesis involves the idea of a different mode of being from that of existential fact. This mode of being seems to claim immediate recognition as evident in the mere idea of it. One asks whether there is not a fallacy in using the ordinary processes of logic either to support it or to refute it. Aristotelianism admitted 2 modes of being. This position was attacked by William McCam, on the ground that one kind sufficed to account for all the phenomena. The hosts of modern philosophers, to the very Hegels, have sided with McCam in this matter. But now the question comes before us for reexamination: what are the modes of being? One might antecedently expect that the Cenopythagorean categories would require 3 modes of being. But a little examination will show us that they could be brought into fairly presentable accordance with the theory that there were only 2, or even only 1. The question cannot be decided in that way. Besides, it would be illogical to rely upon the categories to decide so fundamental a question. The only safe way is to make an entirely fresh investigation. But by what method are we to pursue it? In such abstract questions, as we shall have already found, the first step, often more than half the battle, is to ascertain what we mean by the question, what we possibly can mean by it. We know already how we must proceed in order to determine what the meaning of the question is. Our sole guide must be the consideration of the use to which the answer is to be put, not necessarily the practical application, but in what way it is to subserve the summum bonum. Within this principle is wrapped up the answer to the question, what being is, and what, therefore, its modes must be. It is absolutely impossible that the word being should bear any meaning whatever except with reference to the summum bonum. This is true of any word. But that which is true of one word in one respect, of another in another, of every word in some or another respect, that is precisely what the word being aims to express. There are other ways of conceiving being, that it is that which manifests itself, that it is that which produces effects which have to be considered, and their relations ascertained. Having thus worked out a tolerable conception of being, we turn to modes of being. But these are metaphysical conceptions. Let us first inquire how the validity of any metaphysical conception is to be determined. For this purpose, we have only to apply the principles of speculative rhetoric. We sketch out the method and apply it to a few metaphysical conceptions, such as reality, necessity, etc. In the process of doing this, we discover that all such metaphysical conceptions are but determinations of the categories, and consequently form a regular system. We also find that they can be held as valid only in approximative and imperfect senses. But this seems to be in conflict with our conception of being, particularly as derived from the notion of a symbol, which, however, is solidly founded, too. We now begin to see the sense of talking of modes of being. They are elements of cooperation toward the summum bonum. The categories now come in to aid us materially, and we clearly make out three modes, or factors, of being, which we proceed to make clear to ourselves. Arrived at this point, we can construct a Weltanschauung. From this platform, ethics acquires a new significance, as will be shown. Logic, too, shines forth with all its native nobility. Common men carry this Weltanschauung in their breasts, and perhaps the pimp, the looting missionary, the Jay Gould, may, through the shadows of their degradation, catch now and then a purer glimpse of it, than the most earnest of citizens, the Curtises, the Emersons, the Bishop Myriels. It is beautifully universal, and one must acknowledge that there is something healthy in the philosophy of faith, with its resentment at logic as an impertinence. Only, it is very infantile. Our final view of logic will exhibit it, on one side of it, as faith come to years of discretion.